very difficult thing to follow with that song. Is one of my favorites, sitting in my driveway as I get home at night and to listen to that and waiting for the song to finish before I go in and have dinner. I stand before you today as one of Steve's products of all his teachings. See if I can get through this here. First, I want to read something for you here, and says, and I read this to Steve several days before his death, and I want to thank Jan and the family for allowing me to be a part of that. It says, "Come to me with all your weakness, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Rest in comfort of my presence, remembering that nothing is impossible with me. Pry your mind away from your problems so you can focus your attention on me. Recall that I'm able to do immeasurably more than you ask or imagine. Instead of trying to direct me to do is this and that, seek to attune yourself to that what I'm already doing. When anxiety attempts to wedge its way in your thoughts, remind yourself that I am your shepherd. The bottom line is that you are taken care of, that I'm taking care of you. Therefore, you needn't be afraid of anything. Rather than trying to maintain control over life, abandon yourself to my will. Though this may be frightening, even dangerous, the safest place to be is in my will." I'm here to celebrate one of my dearest friends, Steve Bellamy. Just over a week ago, I had the privilege to sit with Steve and thank him for all that he has bestowed on me. What struck me is the first words that he said to me that day was, "How are you doing?" Which I still taken back with that is that on his deathbed, he was worried about how I was doing. In the 25 years of our friendship, he always put others' well-being in front of his. As we spoke, I went on to thank him for teaching me the following: canoeing, kayaking, sailing, ropes course, and most of all, strength and patience. Steve was a man of many talents. Very few people had the opportunity to impact so many lives with the love, kindness, and the patience he displayed to thousands of youth. He truly was guided by the will of God. I stand before you as a product of his teachings, and I'm truly grateful for all that the wisdom and knowledge he offered me. I thank the Lord for the opportunity to sit next to Steve and express my sincere thanks. Thank you, Jan. In closing, I had the opportunity to listen to one of the greatest storytellers that I've ever listened to on our way to North Carolina. This trip lasted about 12 hours, and I think Steve probably only paused for about 3 minutes between all the stories. And I know this because I was actually timing him at the time. And we were just wondering when it was going to stop. And it stopped when we got to our destination. So for that, I thank him for all those. And that was the way he taught everybody. And sometimes it's a great way of teaching all of us when he was telling those stories. So in closing, I love you, my dear friend.
This is the day that the Lord has made, and we're going to rejoice and be glad in it. And I'm Dusty Sawyer. I'm Steve's only sister, his oldest sibling. We have a younger brother, Roger, and our mom is still with us. And I've come from California, and we came in on Christmas night, and I was so pleased to have this last week with Steve and Jan and the boys and the family. And it's been a difficult time, but it's been a blessing, and I thank you, pastors, for being there with us and for all that we've had. Mom talks about Steve as being a full of energy and full of love little boy. And I remember him as a child just being so full of everything. And we grew up in Miami in a new neighborhood where we had, I think, 30 kids on our block. So we were all playing outside all together all the time, and it was just a great childhood, and I'm so thankful for that. Steve was a very protective kid, and if you were his friend, you were his friend. And in fact, in first grade, his teacher was a little person, and she was reprimanding another child in the class, and Steve thought she was being too harsh, and he told her about it. And so I'm sure she was a little intimidated because, you know, Steve was a big man. He was a big kid, too. And, but he was very affectionate and very loving. And when I see Grayson being so sweet and loving and rushing up to GGB, great-grandmother Barbara, and all of us, he's just, it makes me think of Steve, that he was with that kind of enthusiasm, and I'm very thankful for it. Our dad was a hard worker, and I felt like he worked all the time. He was a good man from Inverness, Florida, and that's where his ashes are going to be, and he's in the plot in the Bellamy family plot in Inverness. But the big deal for us as kids, if mom had some illnesses as a kid, and when we would go to work with Daddy, and it was a big deal to go to work with Dad for the day, and we would go and stop and have a Coke in the afternoon. So that was a great memory as a child. Steve was active in Scouts when he was up through high school, and so when I went off to college, Steve was still in high school, and I went to live with cousins in Leesburg, and their kids called me the girl Steve. So Steve had an impression on everybody, every place he went. It's all about Steve. So hard act to follow. Steve went to Bible school, as Pastor mentioned, in Newbury Park, California. Well, as it turns out, I moved to California almost 50 years ago now, and I live in Newbury Park, California. And so my pastor knew Steve when they were in Jesus Christ Light and Powerhouse. Is that the name of it? And so that's where we were the first to get to meet Jan. And my kids were so excited. My husband has a big family. We had our own family. We were getting our own aunt. And our kids were so excited about meeting Aunt Jam, as they called her at that time. Steve first witnessed to my husband, Jim. This is where I might get emotional. Steve tried to tell Jim about having a relationship with the Lord, and my husband was a very good man, has been for many years, and Jim appreciated Steve's concern for him, but he just had no interest in it. So he thanked him very much, and Steve just went about his business, living his life and witnessing to Jim. Well, 15 years later, Jim came to the Lord. Jim's a strong Christian. He's an elder in our church, and no one ever believed that could ever happen. But I think about Steve's witness always, that's the way he lived his life, as Greg said. He lived his life, and he told people the truth, and he let them deal with it, and he knew it was up to God to do with it what he wanted to do. Steve also reminded me one time when I was talking to him about Jim that there are people who sow seeds, there are people who nourish seeds, who tend to seeds, and then there are harvesters. And Steve got to be a lot of those things, and I just so appreciate that about him. But he put himself in a position to do that, and we know that God's called us all to do that. So I thank him for that example. We got to go to the wedding in Phoenix, and our kids got to know Jan's family some, and our son fell in love with her cousin, Betsy was probably in her 20s at the time, and she danced with the kids and so forth, so we got a chance to get to know her family a little bit better, and the beautiful reception in a downtown park, I think it was, and it was great. One of the funny stories about Steve was when they lived in Oklahoma. He was they did a fashion show at his church, and it was called a Tootsie fashion show. Now, a lot of you aren't old enough to know who Tootsie was, But it was a movie about a man an actor who couldn't get a job, and so he decided to dress up as a woman, and he got a role. And then he had to go follow through with it. So this Tootsie fashion show was men in the church who were dressed up in women's clothing, and it was back when that would have been funny. I don't know what all fashions they had, but the pièce de résistance was the bride at the end. And Steve was the bride. And Jan had never seen Steve without a beard, and he had shaved it off. And he came out, and there was silence. Nobody knew who it was. So that was great. It's probably the only time in his life he hasn't, well, since he could grow a beard, that he didn't have a beard. So I love that story, and I wish I could have I'd been there to see that. My kids sent letters before Steve died, and some of the things that they said about him, all in common, was that he was an adventurer, he was an out-of-the-box thinker, he was always available. One time when I was here visiting, my daughter in North Carolina, had to have emergency surgery. Steve stopped what he was doing and drove me to North Carolina and stayed with me for several days. He was always generous with time and money. He was a leader and a mentor who taught by example. Greg mentioned that earlier. He was spontaneous and resourceful and wise. My oldest daughter was 14 when we moved from California to North Carolina for 5 years, and that was a very difficult time, and Steve kind of had a little come to Jesus meeting with her and taught her about how to bloom where you're planted, and she says that was a great message for her at that time. He was always hospitable, but he wanted things simple, right, Jan? Didn't have to put on airs, didn't have to do all this sort of stuff. He just wanted things simple. He loved barbecue and peanut butter and chocolate shakes and banana pudding. So a real down-to-earth man. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells his disciples that it's time for his glorification. So I'd like to read to you. You know, I forgot to mention that we've had opportunities to travel with Jan and Steve over the years with our families, our combined families. The kids know each other, and living in California, it's such a gift to me to have that with our Florida and East Coast family, our southern family. And we have cousins here who have come from Atlanta today, and cousins coming from all over, and I'm so appreciative of everybody coming. Jan's family has come from Arizona and parts unknown, and we've combined families. We've had wonderful family time together. But I wanted to read to you from John 14. As Jesus is comforting his disciples, he says, "Let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you so. For I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you will be also." And Thomas says to him, "Well, how do we know where you're going?" And he says, "You know the way. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me." And Steve, in our final talks before he was gone, kept telling me, "Dusty, I know where I'm going. I'm fine. Don't worry. Just, I know where I'm going." And we've been so blessed to have that. Steve was the first in our family to become a Bible teacher and so forth. He set an example for us, and I'm so thankful for that he responded to the Lord. So as I close today, I thank you for your friendships here, the family who's here. I'm just so blessed to be part of this. God bless you all.
In 2011, Steve Bellamy went on a mission trip to Puerto Rico. 2 high school boys were so impressed with him as his adventures and stories that they created this video.